Shall we kick things off here?
Yeah, let's get going.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us again for another exciting hour of Freerun talks. And you're not seeing triple. You have three bald gentlemen here. My host, Dustin Wilson of Verve Wine in New York City, and Mike Laszlo of Laszlo Law in Boulder, Colorado, whom we finally pressured into shaving his head as part of the quarantine challenge.
He's looking good.
You're looking very good.
I'm feeling good.
Head.
Very good. So we're also going to be joined today by a good friend and amazing talented chef, Lachlan Mackinnon-Patterson, who you may know of Frasca Food and Wine, co-founder of that, as well as Pizzeria Locale, and James Beard Foundation Award winner. And they're actually announcing the finalists today, this afternoon, which will be exciting to see. But before we get to Lachlan, wanted to just sort of talk about what's been going on this week. And one thing that caught my eye was that it was the first time that we started to hear about big name restaurants closing. And if you look around the country, in New York, they announced the Pegu Club would not be returning. They've been in business for 15 years, one of the iconic craft cocktail bars. In LA, Bon Temp, which was Esquire's best new restaurant this past year. They opened in June of 2019. Albarn, another really aspirational tasting menu restaurant. And look who's here. There is Lachlan. Thanks for joining us, Lachlan. And we're just talking about some restaurant closings that we heard about this week. And McCrady's in Charleston. That's actually where I took my intro exam many years ago. But McCrady's has been in business for 23 years in Charleston, and they announced they're not going to be reopening, along with Monero, their taco concept, which was just upstairs. And in Dallas, Wolfgang Puck, after 11 years, is closing down his restaurant, 560. So those are just the ones that we hear about. And I think that the sad thing is we're going to hear many more, and there's not really an obituary for these. But when you look at those, there's really no rhyme or reason. And something that stood out in Gabrielle Hamilton's article last week was a quote that she had where she says, "Everybody's saying that restaurants won't make it back, that we won't survive." And I imagine this at least partly true. Not all of us will make it, and not all of us will perish. But I can't easily discern the determining factors, even though thinking about which restaurants will survive and why has become an obsession the past weeks. And I think that's the unfortunate thing, is that there's no rhyme or reason why one may or may not, as we look at this landscape. And a lot of our guests won't understand that as well. And so when we start coming up with how we get out of this, there's no one silver bullet. You know, restaurants are like snowflakes, but I do think that there's, right now, one of the biggest challenges I think has been mentioned in a couple of those have to do with their leases. And that's a big conversation, especially being kind of the first of the month and people having to make those payments, that's really going to tighten the screws on a lot of businesses and really fast forward some conversations people are having with landlords. And so I guess when we look at that, Mike, when you think of leases, I know there was an article that Gabe Stolman had written in Eater, but what are you feeling with leases right now, and what's the current state?
Well, that article is interesting, and kind of going back to something you just said. All restaurants are snowflakes, all situations are different. It's absolutely true, but there are common themes and common issues facing everybody, and of course the lease is one of them. I mean, very few operators own their own business, and even if they do, they've probably leased it to themselves. That article is interesting because it does hit on some very good points, those being that there are often personal guarantees on these leases, and these are massive leases. Oftentimes we'll see 10-year leases, multi-million dollars over that period of time, and you have a personal guarantee of one owner or multiple owners. And what does that mean in a situation like we're dealing with now with COVID? And what that means is, if my business goes dark and I go out of business, the landlord can come after me personally to enforce that guarantee. What is the reality there? Yeah, I could lose my house. I could lose my personal assets. I mean, that is absolutely true. But what is is the landlord going to do that for every single lease? Probably not. It's going to be where that landlord sees the availability of assets to fulfill part of that lease. But this goes back to something we've talked about so many times over the past couple of weeks is treat this as a partnership. Do your best to work with your landlord and say, hey, look, this is how my business is changing and we got to work together. You got to cut me a break. You might actually have to give me free rent, not deferred rent. You might actually have to just take nothing for 3 months, but I will come back to the space. Here's my plan and here's how I'm going to make it work. That's what has to be happening right now with leases. But everybody needs to read every single part of their lease. If they haven't already, they need to understand it now, because there's going to be other parts of that lease that might provide obligations for you as well that you don't know about. And we're going to talk about some of that today. But just simple things like, do I have to actually be operational under the lease? Am I allowed to just shut my doors for a month? Many of the leases I see for my clients, no, you're in a mall, you're in a strip mall, or you're in an area where you're important to the entire business plan. So you have to be operational. And now I can't be because the government told me I couldn't, or it's not good business sense. Now you have to figure out how to work with the landlord on that. So there are so many different issues in each lease that you need to be considering. But yeah, that article was good to put that, I think, that in people's minds.
Yeah, and just for those that didn't see that, it's actually under, I believe under discussions, you'll see that we link to that there. And Gabe, for those that don't know, he has Happy Cooking Hospitality in New York, about 6 restaurants like Joseph Leonard, Jeffrey's Grocery, Simon and the Whale, and basically 3 of his landlords were willing to work with him, and then 3 were not. And so it was the struggles he was facing in looking for rent reform in New York City. With that,
I got to say, I just think it's silly and short-sighted for a landlord to say we will not work with you. I mean, I litigate all the time, and one of the big tenets is you can't squeeze blood from a stone. So why are we going to sue you for nothing? And why are we going to be bullish and enforce a provision or enforce a lease where there's just nothing? I have that going on with a client right now. You look at this landlord and you're like, dude, what are you going to do here? Like you should be trying to work with us to figure out a way to keep us healthy and paying you. You're just going to call default on a 10-year lease. Come on, that's just silly. If he was my client, I'd argue, I'd probably counsel him against that.
And I was talking with another restaurant owner last week, and they were about to have a conversation with their landlords and the pros and cons of different routes. And this one, they I think had about another 1.5 years left on their lease, and we're also trying to potentially renegotiate for a longer term with it, and kind of got to the idea of, well, maybe you negotiate a short term to get over this hump that is more favorable for you in this term, and then how do you go back to something that's more traditional in the eyes of the landlord, but really trying to think outside the box with it.
Not to belabor this too much, but you may also threaten bankruptcy. And then the landlord's just not going to get their money. So that's also something, and I think that's probably what we're seeing from J. Crew right now. I think the news this morning was J. Crew's going bankrupt, and my guess is that's to work with a ton of old terrible leases they've had for the past 20 years, and try to restructure that and go to a different model. Cheesecake Factory did that a couple months ago. I think that was the whole thing. They just said, nope, we're not going to pay any of our leases, and it's an opportunity to restructure. Different than the single operator restaurant. I get that, but similar themes.
One of and kind of segueing from that to another topic is one thing that Gabe did was pivot Jeffrey's Grocery, which is a restaurant, into a pickup, doing meal kits. And I don't think he's doing delivery there, but there's been a lot of talk about delivery and people that are using it successfully, but then there's also people that are struggling with it as they start to see the fees. Dustin, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to see what's going on. You have to kind of take a moment and think about how people were structuring delivery before all of this started and how they're looking at it now. I think a lot of restaurants, when they were able to fill their dining rooms with people and then also do delivery on top of that, it was a really nice kind of gravy to the business, right? And maybe the menu items that they were using for delivery were kind of structured the same way from a cost standpoint as everything else on their menu, but they weren't paying too close attention to the economics of just delivery on its own. But it was fine because it was just extra revenue that was layering on top of what they had in the dining room, and any incremental profits that they made from it were, just nice to add to the bottom line. But then once you close down those dining rooms, and these restaurants are relying strictly for only on delivery for any source of revenue, all of a sudden, every dollar matters, and that cost structure really starts to matter. So, a hot topic right now is how much these delivery companies like Grubhub or Uber Eats or Caviar, or what have you, how much of the pie of revenue are they taking from these restaurants? And it's a heated debate. And, granted, it can be a fair percentage, right? So I think, there's a few sides to this argument, and personally, I'm on the side of, watch out what you sign up for, right? Because this is a product that the restaurant is purchasing, and when you sign up for it, you should kind of make sure you're paying close attention to what you're signing up for. But secondly, if you realize that there are these fees, you do have the opportunity also to kind of restructure how you look at your delivery services and what you're putting on your menu, right? So, for one, I think it's totally appropriate to maybe increase your pricing by a little bit to try to make up for the fact that there's going to be chunks of it taken out for these delivery charges, or perhaps use only more high margin items on your menu that you're going to set up for delivery, or if you want to keep your pricing the same, find ways to cut the actual food costs on the item to make up for this missing margin that the delivery companies are taking. Also, be careful too when you're looking through your agreements, because typically there's a delivery fee, and then you may also be paying a marketing commission, that's what they call it, which is basically through their algorithms, if you want to get kind of bumped up to the top, like if you're on Seamless here in New York, for example, and you want to show up as one of the featured restaurants a little bit more often than others, work their algorithm, so to speak, you might be paying a higher marketing commission. Of course, your restaurant's going to show up on the top more often. Now that's really great because you're going to get a lot more clicks, you're going to get a lot more orders, but then you're also going to be paying a lot more for that. So you have to determine what's best for you. So I think that the general idea here is to look at it from, all right, this used to be a layer on top of my business before, but now it's the only part of my business. So you have to look at it for, really closely from a cost standpoint and how to adjust for that. The other piece of this too is, I look at these companies as potential marketing platforms, right? So if you kind of take the idea of, think about how Google can potentially bring in customers to a retail setting, like what I work with, for example. Our goal after you've already clicked through and started buying from us is to retain you. So, we use Google, or we use Facebook ads or Instagram ads or something to acquire a customer, but then it's up to us to retain them, right? So it's classic, customer acquisition versus retention marketing. Now, the tricky part with things like Seamless or these third-party delivery companies is you're paying that marketing fee, that customer acquisition fee, every single time, which is not a great use of funds, right? So your goal should be maybe try to utilize these companies as marketing acquisition or customer acquisition platforms, but then do your best to work on retention on your own, whether that means, and I know these companies aren't really giving much customer information over, if any at all. So maybe that means putting something into every single delivery that's going out the door that's like, hey, please, next time, order directly from us. Here's our phone number. Here's our website. You can order online. Here's an email address, however you'd like to do it. Give them some sort of an incentive to do so, right? They may actually save a couple of bucks, and what you're maybe giving them as a discount overall, if you match it up to what they would pay, what you'd be paying as a business otherwise versus the platform, you're probably still saving some money there too. So I think if you can kind of internalize a lot of those customers that you're getting traffic from on these sites and make them yours instead of relying on the platform itself to drive sales all the time, that can be a way to also mitigate some of these extra costs.
And Lachlan, you obviously have a lot of experience with the delivery, especially on the pizzeria side. What are your learnings in terms of even before, as you were starting to get into that world, and now as it's almost all shift to pickup or for time was more pickup and delivery?
Mm-hmm. Well, guys, first of all, thanks for having me. And you know, I think this platform that you guys have going on here is just so amazing, because the real, I think, takeaway from all of this is that, you know, no one knows what's going to happen here. And so this is just one episode of another after, you know, just an incredible amount of thought thinking and options and learnings for so many different restaurants. You know, we have businesses across 3 different channels in the food and wine space. And so in particular, perhaps for this audience, it's maybe the contrast between, say, quick service and full service. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, on the full service side, you know, I've got an amazing team of people that are doing, you know, everything they can to think creatively about revenue streams outside of, you know, in dining. And on the quick service side, the whole business has turned into really a digital kitchen, you know, and so it's allowed us to really think very differently about that investment we made about 18 months ago on the digital side. It was a very much an incremental business. Mm-hmm. It was a slow developing business. It was difficult to integrate. You know, it wasn't a digital kitchen, so if there was a huge in-store flow, sometimes the digital experience could suffer. And so we had to throttle that back, and we had to throttle it up. And, you know, and so now that the restaurants are simply digital only, we're just learning a ton. And thank goodness we invested in that digital side 18 months ago, because it's serving us really, really well. You know, I do think that, you know, Dustin brings up some really interesting points. You know, we work, you know, with every single, you know, national service when it comes to third-party delivery. But we also aggregate those into a platform where we have, you know, ordering capabilities and customer retention piece on the website, right? So what we're trying to do is juggle the difference between marketing, say, with an Uber Eats, marketing, say, directly with a DoorDash, marketing directly with a Grubhub, marketing directly with those platforms, right? Which we would consider those platforms, you know, off the rails. Mm-hmm. They send us business, versus the on the rails, which is our, you know, our website platform, which will dispatch out to those same providers, but our retention is significantly higher. So we're not paying out the same fees every time something comes through us and we dispatch it, versus something comes through them. And I think you're going to see, it reminds me a lot of the reservation industry, how much that's changed for the full service side over many years, where there was such a high cost in setting a reservation up, say OpenTable, right? A good example would be, you know, like a regular customer, or someone who came once a week, once a month. You know, if they made the reservation every time they came in on OpenTable versus picking up the phone and calling you, you paid to, you know, retain that customer every single time they ate with you. You know, we all, you know, as restaurateurs, we have many of those kinds of guests. And then there was some disruption in that space, so that you could own more of the data. You weren't paying that same amount. Perhaps there were monthly fees, but there were all these other things you could aggregate out of this customer info. And I think you're going to see that on this online piece. I would encourage all the, you know, full service friends out there to really start reading about that. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if a company like Olo, who typically does, you know, multi-unit, and like to have, you know, a patch of, you know, 10, 11 restaurants or so, I would be surprised to see them, you know, stand up an office that's dealing with, you know, independently run restaurants, because, you know, a lot of these restaurants have enormous followings, you know, enormous brands, huge email lists. They're incredibly active in the community. They've been around a long time. You know, Prune is a great example, right? Like, imagine all the fans that Prune has. And what if all of a sudden Olo stood up a separate division that was just for independent restaurants, and Gabrielle could take her mailing list of, you know, decades and start pumping that through. In addition to, as Dustin said, raising the price a little bit on those menu items. The combination of those two working together could be the difference between, you know, what is already a low margin business to begin with, mid-single digits. And in this environment, when you're looking for these transitions, these ways to claw back a 10%, a 12%, a 15%, will become so much more important.
Yeah, and you mentioned Olo, and for those that may not be familiar with it, Olo is basically a white labeled solution, stands for online ordering, that you could basically make it look like yours, but then it interfaces with the others. And with that, you then can feed into the others with it. And traditionally it's used for people that have, you know, 20, 30 restaurants. But to your point, Lachlan, maybe this is an opportunity for them to go into that. And I think that through this, you're seeing a lot more guests being educated on the fees and how that works. And as a result, I think people are empathetic to the situation restaurants are in and say, okay, if I call, it's actually more affordable. It's better for the restaurant. If I go pick it up, that's even better for the restaurant. And so maybe just to your point, Dustin, how do you message that? How do you incentivize and reward guests after you do that so you can actually turn it into an acquisition with that? So.
Mm-hmm. Real quick, as we're talking delivery, we have a question here from Rita Jamé. Hello.
Hey, Rita.
Hey, Rita.
Thanks for joining. She asks, I thought the delivery companies were waiving the fees during the pandemic.
So I think some of them have done taken various routes with that. Some have waived the delivery fees for the guests, but haven't shown relief on the restaurant side. I believe some have delayed payments on that. So I'm not really sure there's a universal response from those, but I think that would be definitely a great way to help restaurants survive. Obviously, those companies still have to survive as well, but realizing that we're all part of the same ecosystem, I think is very important. And so anything that they can do to help restaurants in this and playing the long game, I think is a win-win for them in that.
And there's been talk, I think it was also in an article last week about whether the New York City Council or maybe it was even the state legislature was thinking about some type of a law to cap those fees or to limit those fees. I admit I haven't read those proposals, but that's a government interfering with private contract. I don't like it, and I don't think businesses should like it, because where's that going to stop? Quick relief on a. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think a lot of Rita's questions centered around. There's quite a bit of publicity for that. She's absolutely right. Most of these things were stood up as limited time offers. So they sounded great in the press. They got a lot of newsprint and, traction on Instagram and whatnot, but, they expired and many of them expired, but it was a way to quickly try to transition people from, going out and eating to ordering online, because, restaurants, even a quick service restaurant, right, that perhaps stayed open, as we did across our pizzerias in Denver, there's an immediate huge decline in sales, right? Like, in other words, it wasn't one day they got, they closed the dining rooms and the next day everyone just transitioned online. So even though we've clawed back, quite a bit of that and are down, say, -12, that took time. And I think a lot of those online providers wanted to accelerate that transition as fast as possible because they realized what an opportunity it was. And so many of these things were limited time offers and they slowly scaled back or expired.
Yep.
And so Lachlan, when you obviously have, from our conversation today, a vast view of this world and what we're going through right now, which is fascinating, I think, for all of us. And you're dealing in both the fast casual and the fine dining. And obviously it's impacting both of those very differently. But what are some of the crossover learnings that one could learn from another as we embark on this new world?
Well, I think that probably the strongest parallel is, first and foremost, I think liquidity is the most important thing for everyone right now. And I think it's sad that so little of the economic relief has actually landed in the hands of independent restaurateurs. There's been billions doled out, but the percentages are very low. So I think to start off with, the biggest thing that I would encourage all restaurateurs to do, whether they have multi-unit, they're independent, they're small QSR, whatever it may be, is the first step is try to figure out, can you still get some additional funds, relief funds, what's available to you, and if there's nothing available or as things dry up again, I would encourage all of those restaurants to get heavily involved with Independent Restaurant Coalition because Congress and your representatives, they get tired of hearing from people and they do want to make a change. And there's, as we know, there's, 15 million people that could write a letter would make a huge difference, as opposed to, 10,000 people writing letters. And so that's that. Then I would say everyone should just devour as much healthcare information as possible, whether it's coming from Europe or it's coming from WHO or it's coming from CDC, because ultimately, taking all this into consideration, how much money you have left, how much money you're able to get, crisscrossing that with the health situation, because no one frankly knows what's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. And then setting out what I like to call like a 12 to 18 month calendar, right? Because as a business, you need to assume that maybe there isn't going to be a vaccine for 12 or 18 months. The good thing is that there will be a vaccine at some point, and guess what? It's all going to go away. And so those that can get to the other side will be in incredible shape. The question is, how do you get there? Mm-hmm. And this is the biggest thing to consider. And so before I weave directly back into your question specifically, I would say that on that journey, on that 12 to 18 month journey, you know, account for the fact that it may be possible that in the beginning, it's safer to be closed than it is to be open. And maybe that safer is because safety of employees, because of the lack of testing and contact tracing, it just doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's safer for the business. It has some reserves, and it knows that by opening and putting the employees in danger or running into speed bumps along the way in an already very challenging environment, that operating at 50% speed just isn't going to work. Mm-hmm. And that small reserve you have will be hemorrhaged during that time. Mm-hmm. It also needs to perhaps account for the fact that we don't know, but what if there's another shutdown or some sort of quarantine in the wintertime? It may happen. So what does 2 additional months, perhaps 3 months of no revenue look like? Do you have that accounted for in that reserve that you got? And then I would also say that the challenges of just simply operating with this invisible virus. What does the morale look like with the team that has to wear a mask all the time? I know we're dealing with it in Denver. It's very, very challenging, and I have some suggestions on that. But in full service restaurants, people do work long shifts. Mm-hmm. And to wear a mask for 10 plus hours will be very different. Mm-hmm. What does the environment look like for guests? Do they want to come to restaurants with a mask on, mm-hmm. right? Or do they not? Right? What would it look like in the event that a staff member got infected? You know, on the Denver side, we have these protocols for that. But that does.
What are some of those protocols that you put in place?
Well, so those protocols would basically, if one of the employees got infected, and keep in mind, there's many checks and balances along the way in order temperature checking and contactless ordering and pickup and all these kinds of things, and extra cleaning and PPP and all these things that we're doing. But in the event that someone did get infected, we would have to close the restaurant and disinfect the restaurant. And then because we can't physically contact trace, mm-hmm. we can only contact trace with one tool: the scheduling, who was there, when was the last time they were working, who was with them. And so this is something that is not only can be expensive mm-hmm. to close the restaurant for a couple of days and sanitize all of it. Mm-hmm. It can also be expensive because now you might not have the team to reopen. It could be expensive from a PR situation, when all of a sudden in the community you're viewed as a restaurant that perhaps is a hot spot, right? And these things are all really out of all of our control. And so that calendar, I think, is critical. Is that what does the business look like so that it's an incredible place to work for everyone once we get through this, and we will get through it. The question is just how long, and no one knows, right?
I like how you mentioned it's like looking at it from 18 months basically, but also that it might be safer to close. And that goes into saying, okay, if you look at it, what do you layer on? Maybe it's more profitable, or maybe it's safer, not necessarily profitable, but it's safer to be closed and maybe just doing deliveries or kits until you can sort of get some stability under you and some of that liquidity. And then what's the next layer, and really having mile markers to set that up. But it's, you know, all those things that most people say, oh, well, great, once we open, it's back to what it was like before in terms of just steady state. But in reality, all those potholes that could be out there, you need to plan for those. Just like if you're opening a restaurant, you don't just open and say, wait, we have no cash and reserves. You know, you build up a reserves for when those rainy days do come.
That's right. I mean, any good operator, any good business owner is always hedging risk, mm-hmm. right? And so the downside risk would be there's no vaccine for 18 months. This is going to be one hell of a ride, mm-hmm. Right? The upside would be a vaccine comes much sooner than we thought, the new year perhaps, or sometime in spring. And along the way, the states really take over this testing piece, so that contact tracing really is possible, and not only possible, perhaps even possible for businesses to do. And I would say that's the other end of the spectrum. And so long as you can adapt to both, you will be okay. But you have to adapt to both. Because no one has the answer. I do think that, you know, the big learning experience for us, and one thing I think that we'll take away forever from this, is this whole concept of really separating and digging into the difference between producing and production and servicing, right? And usually, like in a good environment, those things are often very intertwined, right? You have restaurants that may do prep in the morning and serve at dinner, but you also have restaurants that mix both of those things throughout the day, right? In an environment like this, there is huge efficiencies in really isolating those things, right? Because if you isolate production and they don't interact with a service team, if someone gets infected on one, they're not infecting the other, right? In addition, at a time when, in a normal world, say, when there's low single-digit returns in full-service restaurants, right? If you try to then say, well, how could we operate at less 40, less 30, less 50? Then you start really digging into those teams. There's enormous efficiencies in both operating those both separate channels, right? And so let me give you an example. I really truly do believe that all this creative work that's being done, you know, by our full service restaurant team with kits, by many other restaurant groups around the country, and there's, you know, a lot more that certainly will come out of this, and we will see all sorts of incredible ideas, everything from like becoming retailers, shipping grocery, etc. You know, I think that the wonderful part about this learning experience is those things will likely last when this is done. Because if we go through a year where all of a sudden a restaurant becomes an incredible meal kit provider, a content creator for their Rolodex of email subscribers, or they're advertising on Instagram or whatever it is, they build this kit, and perhaps they end up building some sort of a subscription business, if you will, much like Dustin would have with Verve. You know, when things get back to operating again, there's going to be an opportunity to pull that production out as it is just as production, and putting it into these exploding ghost kitchens and cloud kitchens. So even though that business doesn't work well when you're fully operational, it actually could be removed once you work. So you're using the physical space you have, which clearly you already have an incredible amount of fixed costs on, taking advantage of. It's a terrible situation, right? But once we're done, all of that effort can still be maintained. We will have changed habits for so many people. They will still desire this incredible vinegar that only this one restaurant could find somewhere in Italy, perhaps, or this wine that, you know, Dustin seems to get more than anyone else, say, or some story that someone created. And so I think that there is an incredible upside in this long term. But I think right now, restaurants need to separate those two things, both for safety and for efficiency.
And are you playing with that on the pizzeria side in terms of separating production and actually the fulfillment?
You know, we are. You know, we always you know, prided ourselves on this concept of that while it was a quick service restaurant, there was real cooking and classic cooking techniques going on. And what we've realized is that why don't we try to do all those same things but do them somewhere else? So we actually took the restaurant that had the most capability, perhaps that wasn't getting inundated with on the digital side as much as the others, and we turned that restaurant into a developing commissary kitchen. And so it's still operating as its own restaurant. It's still servicing its digital and pickup business, but it has additional capacity. So we could separate some of the team out of our busiest restaurant, stand up a commissary kitchen inside an existing restaurant. And really what that's allowed to do is us to keep the food exactly the same, but then really look into what it's like to operate these two channels completely separately. And it will likely lead to smaller real estate in the future. It may lead to, you know, more pickup windows, perhaps. It may lead to us digging into, you know, smarter pickup times. Exactly how long does it take to produce the order that someone's requesting? And when we get back to normal, perhaps they just drive up to a window and we hand them the pizza and they drive away, you know? And so I think these things are enormous opportunities right now when you can start to say, let's separate these two channels completely and really dig into them as separate businesses.
Cool. And I think one thing that's great is, you know, we hear a lot of people talking about, oh, we should do a commissary model, but it's really hard to model and understand what that is accurately. But now you're taking advantage of this downtime to say, hey, let's give it a try. And how sustainable is this in the long term with it and keeping your teams employed? So I think that's great.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Lach, what's the customer response been to the meal kits at Pizzeria? How's that been?
Well, in Boulder, we're currently not doing meal kits per se out of the pizzeria. On the quick service side in Denver, we're fully operational with a full menu, and you know, that business has been great. You know, and it you know, it always was a good business. I mean, people love to have pizza delivered. That's not something that's a stretch for folks, right? We're not talking about everyone getting addicted to delivered roast chicken. You know, this is an industry that's always, you know, kind of serviced that. But you know, what we're learning more about now is what it looks like independently, and what habits may remain, and how best to deal with that in the interim and long term. You know, I think that you know, as someone may have mentioned, you know, one of the reasons it's so difficult for a full service restaurant to also be great at delivery and pickup is because they really are two different channels. Mm-hmm. They require different assembly, they require different space, they require different mindset. Mm-hmm. And it can be in conflict with one another. And it doesn't mean that they're both not good, it just means they're different. Mm-hmm. And so what this lesson has taught us in Denver is how to really better understand what that business looks on its own. Mm-hmm. And it will allow us to better understand how to integrate it back in.
Mm-hmm.
When you take these learnings and look at it for the full service restaurant like Frosca, for example, and taking meal kits, you know, how are you looking at that? What's your strategy? And do you see this as a viable bridge to get you through these next 12 to 18 months, as you say, to get to the other side?
Well, first, let me start by saying that, you know, we've got an amazing leadership team on the Frosca side that's thinking creatively about this every day. And so, you know, I think some of the things that we're discussing are ideas. You know, no one's able to settle necessarily in one way or the other because there's still so many unknowns. But that being said, you know, I do think that if I can speak more broadly about the full service business in general and about the industry in general, you know, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, what's the role of the sommelier, what's the role of the AGM, what's the role of these people going forward? And frankly, I think that, you know, there's great roles for those people, but those roles may be slightly different. You know, it might be writing content for wine classes. It might be taking private dining rooms and turning them into content studios. You know, I can tell you that in my 2 decades of working in full service restaurants, whether I was a stagiaire in France, young, or as say the French Laundry, or you know, in Canada, or you know, with Frosca and et cetera, all of the whole time, you know, the most common thing I think that people become foodies about is just this idea of the access. You know, this idea of how do I get fish like you get? Mm-hmm. You know, how can I buy the olive oil you buy? How can I get that same grain of risotto rice, right? I mean, you make risotto for somebody, and the first question is, what kind of risotto do you use, right? Mm-hmm. And so this, to me, I think is the biggest opportunity for the full service side, and I think that's why the meal kit that our team put together was so successful, because this beautiful Bonamini olive oil from Veneto is fantastic. You don't see a lot of olive oil that's so delicious from the northern part of Italy. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, in one day, we probably shipped out as much olive oil as we'd consume in over a year if we were operating. So, you know, that's a beautiful thing. And I think that people will not forget that. And there's so many other things we could do. And so I would say that every restaurant has a Rolodex of all their, you know, secret suppliers, right? Every restaurant, I know when we do events around the country, I first thing I love to do is go into the dry goods area, right? Like if I do an event with Tosca at Quince, all I want to do is walk through his dry goods closet and see what he's buying that we have never heard about, right? Well, so Mike could just make hours of videos with content people and writers on his team that maybe used to be sommeliers or AGMs, and they could just start shipping that stuff around the country. And when this is done, that business will still exist.
You know, what's interesting is you you hear a lot of people talking about how this is accelerating the world we live in. And let's say 6 months ago it was about Blue Apron, or maybe, you know, a little bit longer ago, people were talking about Blue Apron, and Blue Apron was partnering with some chefs. And then all of a sudden now you have chefs that are saying, hey, we want to do this on our own. And it's that innovation saying, great, we want to do this, but how can we do it and make it our own and make it experiential? And so that bottle of olive oil is going to last after that one meal that they cook. Them learning how to make risotto for the first time is going to be a skill that they have. And every time that they make risotto at a dinner party, they're going to tie it back to that story of, oh, remember in quarantine, we got that meal kit. We saw the chef make the video of it and we learned how to do it. And this olive oil I'm drizzling on it is one of the greatest olive oils from Northern Italy. And I think that's the amazing way of saying, hey, things that may have been off the table before, to be able to say, great, how do we take this, own it, and really lean into it with our style of hospitality is one of those great learnings from it.
Absolutely. I mean, how obsessed have we been over the years, guys, with Chef's Garden, right? I mean, I remember, you know, Chef's Garden was the gold standard, right? If you worked in a restaurant and you got boxes from Chef's Garden delivered, that was the biggest deal there was, right? And just think about the opportunity now to have 1,000 Chef Gardens, 2,000 different Chef Gardens, right? Who doesn't want to taste a French laundry carrot right now without having to spend $1,000 on a meal and flying to Napa or waiting on the phone for 2 hours, 2 months ahead? I mean, that carrot has a lot of value, right? Or Blue Hill at Stone Barns, all the effort, the incredible gardens they have, and with Dan's personality and certainly the wonderful content they could put out. I would love a box from Blue Hill Stone Barns to come once a week to my house, right? And so, and if you're local, you know, we work with so many great providers here, so many good farmers. You know, they're going to struggle this summer with, you know, a farmer's market that won't be in full force, full service restaurants that likely won't be in full force. But how could we help ship some of their products around the country to our fans? And I think that you're going to see a lot of this, and it should really be accelerated because it's incredible. I mean, I always think of it as a virtual CSA, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, as a virtual CSA.
Yeah.
And how cool is that to get, you know, incredible produce from a restaurant where the chef has hand selected it for you, and it comes in a box with this vinegar that he found 10 years ago in Modena, right? Some olive oil from his last trip from Friuli. And a recipe of what to do with it.
My girlfriend and I got the Blue Hill box 2 weeks ago, and it was funny. Our date night was an afternoon surprise. I wouldn't tell her where we were going. Went to walked over to Blue Hill and picked up the box, and it was funny how that qualified as a date night. And we were like kids at Christmas, opening up the box and what's in there, and then pulling it all together and mixing and matching. And it was a lot of fun, and it would be for me. Normally, I love to cook. But it was so interesting to see how that now qualifies as a special occasion, being able to actually bring it home instead of having to go out for that.
That's right.
We all recognize the fact that, you know, 50% occupancy in restaurants just is not going to be a winning formula, right? And we don't know how long that's going to last. So you kind of have to think about how to get outside the four walls of your dining room and connect with people and drive revenue for your business, right? And this is a really interesting way to do it. And also, if you think about it, if you were able to operate at 100% right now, you would not have the opportunity to do this as well. So, you know, you kind of have to look at it from the point of view of like, if we're ever going to lean into this thing and try to build more of an in-home experience and drive this part of you know, piece of the business, now is the time that you can actually do it because your restaurant, from an operations standpoint, you have the capabilities to do so.
And now's the time also where you can say, hey, I may not have this luxury of time a month from now. So how can I actually write my menu for my kits?
Right.
How you can get ahead.
You know, if it kicks off and it's successful and it does really well, you know, can it turn into something that's an ancillary business for you? You know, can you turn it into something that goes off-site once the restaurant is fully operational again and continue to grow that piece of the business? I mean, how great would that be?
Because right now you're only competing with other restaurants, which is a much smaller footprint of people that are using kits or somebody dining at home. Right. As soon as restaurants reopen, you are now competing on the kit side of things with all these other restaurants that are just reopening. And so if you can help condition your guests and help them experience this in this situation, that's how you're going to make a guest or a customer for life in building their confidence in that.
I think there's a lot of advantages from a restaurant's point of view to jump into this if they can, and put a lot of energy into it and be some of the first to market on this. Nobody wants to be necessarily the first to reopen their restaurants, right? Because it's really scary, it's really risky, but you do want to probably be the first to try to jump into this, or one of the first.
With Luck, how are you dealing with health and safety with these types of kits, or when you're sending any type of packaged food around? How are you dealing with the health and safety and communicating that to the guest or to the consumer? I mean, I can throw water on any fire because I'm a lawyer, and I get I'm really interested in what the perception is, and then how you're dealing with these risks. And do you need new insurance for this? I mean, any thoughts on that?
You know what, that's a great question, Mike. And I think that when you can isolate the production and the service separately, as we were just mentioning, you can do a much better job at feeling like you're creating a safe environment, right? For example, if you know that everyone's coming in to make these kits doesn't have a fever, appears to be completely symptom-free, that they're dressed up in the proper PPE gear, that there's this contactless assembly line approach, right? Where the same person that pinched, say, the mussel or, poured the risotto is not the same person that puts the lid on, and so on and so forth. And everywhere down the line, things in work is isolated. I think that we're going to see incredible amount of great safety in that. I think where things get tricky is when you start getting people moving around, and where the service piece is ultimately will be the most trickiest situation. It just will, and there's no getting around it. I know on the quick service side, we installed a lot of things on the floor in terms of keeping people 6 feet apart when they come to pick up. We've also brought food out, so they remain at the door. We bring it to them. So there's various things that we're doing in order to prevent the human-to-human contact and the interaction once the four walls are broken. And I think that this is, going to be the biggest challenge. And, let's face it, the minute that they say that, everyone needs to take the temperature of everybody who walks into a restaurant is the minute no one's gonna be able to find a laser thermometer anywhere on the planet, right? Let alone all the PPE that's going to be required for restaurants. And then what's the protocol around that? Does every staff member get 4 masks? Do they get 5? We all have run into the situation where you wished your server or, back waiter had a cleaner shirt when they arrived, or their shoes looked a little better than they did. Well, how are you going to know that the mask that they brought in wasn't the mask they used yesterday, right? And so how are you going to know they didn't lose 2 or 4 of the masks you gave them out of the 6? Right. And so these are going to be real challenges. And you know what? Nobody has the answer. And again, just the beautiful nature of this platform to throw so many things around that that people can be thinking about. Should they start right now and start collecting PPE? Perhaps. What's the difference between the medical PPE and the cloth PPE you see people making? These are not things that I'm an expert in, but that there's knowledge out there and we need to devour it.
And I think you bring, tying back to the marketing of the transition, people have been in quarantine and have adapted somewhat to life in that, but they haven't necessarily taken that life and then interacted with restaurants, full service restaurants. And so it's how you condition people to do that, or maybe they haven't had a kit from your restaurant, but it goes, I remember this past week seeing the blow that that Mike Pence took by not wearing a mask to the Mayo Clinic. Well, it's the messaging you're sending out on social media, whether it's what the kit looks like or how to pick it up, or walking guests through what that experience like, and make sure all your team is dressed like that. It's in the back of their mind saying, okay, they're thinking of all these nuances to make sure that I'm safe as I go through that. And, if you were to post a picture, an old Instagram picture of a server, serving without a glove today, people will be like, oh my gosh, they're not sitting 6 feet apart. They're not wearing gloves. I remember looking at Rolling Stone magazine a couple of weeks ago, and I had to think, I was like, oh, that picture was taken 3 months ago of people at a concert. It's not happening right now, but we have to condition people to do that before they get to the restaurant.
On the health and safety side of things, it looks like, I just read the Wall Street Journal this morning that part of the issue in Congress right now for additional funding is this type of liability protection for businesses. And it looks like the Senate Republicans don't want any further talk about more money until there's some type of plan in there for businesses to be protected from liability. If I go in and to a restaurant, think that I contracted corona in that restaurant, and in this restaurant, followed procedure and followed the rules, is the restaurant now immune from liability? And so I actually think it's a pretty interesting idea, because one, I mean, how do you ever really prove that somebody caught corona in your restaurant? I mean, let's be realistic here. I mean, that chain of causation would be exceedingly difficult.
Mike, that's assuming that you have criteria of what a restaurant has to do, which I don't think we've seen.
No, we haven't, and I think you'd have to see that. Yeah, you'd have to see that. I think there'd have to be OSHA standards, and then state and city, and just like a health department standards we already have. If you follow these particular standards with respect to food preparation, storage, and those types of things, if and when sued, you can point to that and say, hey, look, I can show that I followed these procedures, and those are the standards of the industry, and therefore I didn't breach the standard. I'm not negligent because I didn't breach the standard in the industry. And so, yes, that legislation couldn't just come out tomorrow and say, okay, you're all immune. It'd have to be a part of a package where there are standards. But that goes to this idea that we're going to do our best, but our best may never prevent the spread of corona. We just we can't move that mountain. It's just there. The other issue, Locke, I wanted to get your opinion on this, is with delivery services. Do we know who these people delivering are? Like, why do we as consumers just seem to think that my pizza goes into a delivery vehicle and it's magically perfectly clean in that delivery vehicle? How do you guard against that? How do you work with that?
Well, look, each one of the providers, certainly the ones we've been talking about, DoorDash, Uber, et cetera, they have their own internal protocols about this way of, dropping off food. And people can request the contactless interaction. But you're absolutely right, Mike. I mean, what we're dealing with here is an invisible virus. And back to your article you read in the Wall Street Journal, one thing that's really in conflict with just that whole concept is that truthfully, in a good contact tracing environment, you would know where you got coronavirus. And so on the one hand, that's what we're hoping to get to. I mean, look at like in South Korea, for example, right? The minute that they have teams of people that can handle a certain amount of traceage every single day. And so if someone gets coronavirus, they're immediately screened and interviewed. They go through a process that then Tracer has access to as many tests as they need to make sure the people that interact with them over the period of a certain amount of days, depending on where their symptoms were, can be tested and isolated. Or in China with these QR codes about where you've been, who you've been in contact with, where you've been, scanned in, where you haven't. The whole idea is actually to know where you got it. That's the whole concept. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how these things are regulated. Is everyone just going to have to say, listen, if I'm going out, there's a chance I could get it, and everyone needs to be almost indemnified of that, right? Because it defeats the purpose of quality contact tracing. You actually do want to know where you got it, and you do want the people that were there to know that that's where they got it, and you also perhaps are at risk.
Yeah. Part of the concern for me will just be on proving that even with contact tracing, you walk from the parking garage to the restaurant. Did you touch a hand railing on the way there? Little things like that. Is it in the air? Somebody you didn't see walked in, just kind of walked in front of you, and that's the big question mark. And then I walked into the restaurant. Did the restaurant give me corona? Because that's where I remember being, and that's what I reported. Those are the little, that's the argument. Those are the little issues there, and I guess you can, you do your best, of course.
I mean, it's challenging too, because we deal with that now. If somebody calls and said, "Oh, I think I might have gotten sick when I ate at your restaurant at lunch today," and you're like, "Okay, let's," we try and do our best to investigate that. But I think the challenge that I see here is twofold. One, it's not just getting sick. We're talking about life and death in some situations. And if somebody was to unfortunately die and say, "Oh, I caught this at that restaurant," or "I went to work at that restaurant," the exposure that puts to that restaurant in terms of being able to overcome that, even if there is any type of protection about an employee or a guest coming after you, I think that's a really challenging one to work through, where if somebody says, you know what, I don't feel safe going to work because I don't think you put the proper procedures in place, or do I get penalized if I live with some elderly people and I'm afraid that I might catch it and take it home to them? So I don't know. I can understand why we would need it. And as a business owner, you'd want to have some sort of protection, but it's a really unique, is there anything similar to that, Mike, that we've dealt with on when it comes to something like this from a legal standpoint?
I mean, the only thing I can think of offhand would be, you know, communicable diseases or viruses that, you know, you go into a restaurant, you say, I caught this here, again, through the food, and you know, that's the only thing I can think of that is similar here, but it's just so different. This is just so very different. You know, it's not.
To your point, Lachlan, earlier, maybe it's safer closed, you know, in that sense, where until it gets to a point where there are systems and there are protocol and procedures in place to ensure that, maybe safer does mean being closed for the business, for the well-being of both your employees, your guests, and the business.
Yeah, he also mentioned the potential PR risk too, right? Like that's a huge thing for restaurants. If you decide to reopen, and then whether or not somebody actually got sick in your restaurant or not, if a story comes out on Eater or some other platform saying like, oh, so-and-so gets sick at this person's restaurant, I mean, kiss your dine-in stuff goodbye, you know?
Yeah, no matter what you did, you're telling everybody what your PR strategy is.
Everything right. Even if you're doing everything right, nobody wants to go to a hot spot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you know, Bobby and I had a conversation about this a week or so ago, just the overall idea that, you know, listen, you know, people will want to go eat in restaurants again. They're going to want to support the brands they love. They're going to crave that. I mean, we're already seeing it with people that are, you know, in states where they're kind of feathering these reopenings. There is a desire. And it's really going to be up to the business to be able just to control the appropriate desire when the time is right.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can do that and not get greedy on a Friday night because you just wish you weren't doing 50% of the business all the time because you can, you just need some more, and all of a sudden you become a hotspot as a result of crowding your bar or letting too many people in, it can backfire, as we've mentioned. And so this is really, I think the whole concept around this notion of, you know, safe or closed. It doesn't necessarily mean closed forever or even closed for many more months. It just might mean closed until you know your calendar lines up with your safety net, and when you know it's safe for both your team and the guests, and you aren't going to run the risk of all these other pitfalls and potholes you might bump into.
Yeah.
So Lachlan, we're going to make it a little more lighthearted now, and we're going to go into what we call our Freerun Freestyle. So we each got a question for you. First off, when this is all over, if you can go have dinner anywhere in the world, which restaurant would you most look forward to visiting when this is all over?
We post a lot about it on Instagram on the Scarpetta side. You know, I can't wait to go back to the seaside of Italy and eat the greatest fish and drink fresh stainless steel white wines. That's what I miss the most. Those crowded restaurants on the sea, Alle Testiere, say in Venice, those kinds of places. I miss those so much.
Yeah. You can't reproduce that with a kit or in the four walls at home.
No.
Well, that was the first kit, so it wasn't without an effort, you know. I mean,
here's some sand you can throw at your feet in your dining room if you want.
Yeah.
So, Locke, my question for you is, if you were to open a new restaurant from scratch in this new environment, the new normal, what would it look like for you?
If I were to open a new restaurant, or if I had a plan to open a restaurant, didn't have a lease signed, or I knew I had a concept and something vetted that would work, I would right away, my first inquiry would be to what Travis Kalanick's doing with Cloud Kitchens, and try to get in on that train, try to get a spot, figure out where they're opening. And that might even mean relocating the concept. And that's what the first thing I would do. I think what they're onto is, it's interesting, the timing. Last thing you'd think is someone who founded Uber would get another crack at it in this way. But I think that the stars are aligning for that idea, and the costs are incredibly low. And I trust that will be a great model for many, especially with a brand that doesn't yet exist.
Locke, my question for you, and I love this question for you because we get to have these conversations all the time, and I get all of your wisdom all the time. Some of it good, some of it, great. Any words of wisdom, any words of wisdom you'd like to impart with our listeners and people watching the show?
I think the only words I would say is from the beginning is just take a long, hard look at this long timeline. Don't get carried away. Take care of your business. After all, while you want to protect the team, and certainly I'm so proud of the different ways in which we're trying to do so. We also want to have a healthy business for the team to return to when it's fully capable. And I worry about those that won't make that decision because it's already so challenging to operate when times are good, and just make sure that you're talking to one another and you're trying to strategize around getting to the finish line, because I can't stress enough. I mean, both my parents are surgeons, and I come from a medical family, and it's so reassuring to talk to them on FaceTime every few nights and have them say, we will get through this because when there's a vaccine, it will be gone. And it's just hard to fathom that. There's all this talk about we're going to live with this forever, and it's going to change the way we fly, and it may to a certain extent. People will still be aware, but I mean, look, we have short-term memory loss. This is one of the great things about us. Once there's a vaccine and we're not scared anymore, we will get going, and I hope that all of us can be there together on the other side.
Definitely.
We've had a couple questions come in, and we're running out of time, but I definitely want to get to a few of them. One, Jill from Alina and Aspen asks, are there additional insurance coverage issues with delivery? And I will just jump on that grenade real quick. Absolutely. If you are with a third-party vendor, most likely the agreements will have indemnifications going that once they picked up the food, it's on them for certain things. But if the food was spoiled, for instance, that's going to come back to you. And then, of course, you can always be sued if somebody just thinks that you're a part of the delivery problem. So make sure that you talk with your insurance brokers, of course, and make sure you have proper coverage for any type of delivery, especially if you're going to be doing the delivery. If you own the vehicle, it's your employee. Do not send that person out until you've got insurance. And I can guarantee you that you're going to need it for that. Next question. What percent, and Locke, this will be for you. What percentage of your revenue is coming from wine/alcohol sales now under the pickup delivery model versus the dine-in model?
Well, on the full service restaurant side, I think we probably wouldn't be the best to answer that question because we're just starting to dabble in what our strategy looks like. I mean, I think it was most important to us right away to take a pause, to get the ship in order, see where we stood, get the team safe, and then to start to reorganize around some of these creative ideas. And we're at the very beginning of that. Okay. So, but, in the case of, say, the meal kit, I think, this is, there was wine included. There was content for that wine included. And, and the check average, without knowing exactly, may have been, 30 to 40% of the revenue. On the PL side, we don't do a lot of alcohol to go. We try to focus on, plus there are some third-party delivery that don't want to deal with that. And you saw what Uber came out with. They're not interested in picking up wine. And so it's, it's 90% food sales. Gotcha.
And just as a reminder, here in Colorado and many other states, third-party delivery are not allowed to handle the alcohol. And so the alcohol to-go sales here in Colorado would be delivered from your own employees in your own vehicles or pickup. And pickup. The other, again, going on here in Colorado is this alcohol takeout delivery is not going to last forever. So, Lachlan, when you're planning 12 to 18 months out, I think it's important probably as well, it's going to be somewhat choose your own adventure on what you can even do because, June 30th, Colorado could say no more to go online or to go and delivery sales of alcohol, and you got to pivot and plan for that. But as long as it's here, you got to take advantage of it. That's right. That's all the questions we've got here. But thank you everybody for listening. And Dustin, why don't you take us out?
Yeah, Locke, huge thanks for joining us today. Great to have you on. To everybody that's watching, thank you all too. Please definitely subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Please share this on your social media. The more people we can get on here and watching, whether it's live or after the fact, we do save all of these on the channel. We'd love that. Please subscribe. Please give us a thumbs up. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Oh, what's going on Friday?
We got something big on Friday. Lachlan.
Oh, yes. Yes. We haven't announced this yet. That's right.
Yep. Dusty, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, we're going to have the one and only Bobby Stuckey here on the Freerun.
That's right. Bobby's going to join us.
What's he going to be talking about?
So we're going to do an impromptu on Friday at 2 p.m. because what the work he's doing, and Lachlan mentioned this earlier, with the IRC is very, very important. And this is a very important time. So timing was key. So we told him that we would absolutely do a show Friday so that he could answer questions and speak about IRC and everything being done for independent restaurants. And so that's an issue that's so key to us, all of us here right now. And we want to make sure we get that out immediately. So Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, New York, and noon, Colorado, 11 Pacific, but Bobby will join us, and we're looking forward to that conversation.
Anybody that's joining as homework to do in advance, you have to go to the IRC website, saverestaurants.com, and you have to sign your name to the petition and email your representatives. So that's your homework between now and Friday, and then pass that along to 10 friends.
That's right. And Locke, thanks again so much. Everybody visit Pizzeria Locale in Frasco.
Yeah, thank you, Locke. That was really great.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
You're the best.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Thanks, everyone.